So let's get started with day 3 of machine learning with Python. Yesterday, we talked about several classification models along with a way to objectively find a good set of hyperparameters using cross-validation procedure. And we also talked about a measure for classifier performance. Often, accuracy is okay, but there are cases where other ones are better, such as F1 score, precision, or recall. Today, we'll talk about regression and some unsupervised learning tasks. So unlike yesterday, the target or the response variable will be continuous value, unlike classification, where the target was labeled for different classes. We will work with linear and some polynomial regression cases, and we will talk about some unsupervised learning cases in clustering and dimension reduction. And we will conclude the workshop. The most important bit from yesterday is steps for selecting hyperparameters and model comparison. First thing to do was split out the test set, which was not to be touched until the very end, which will be kept as the final proof. Doing anything involving that test set in the model fitting process, whether it's variable selection or whether it's dimension reduction, whether it's model fitting in general, that will introduce some bias. And what is commonly done using the remainder of the set would be performing some type of train set validation split. And we often repeat that one or more times to choose the best hyperparameter. So we train a model with each candidate for hyperparameters using the training set and find the validation score on that trained model on the validation set. And one of the more efficient way to do so was through k-fold cross-validation. We split the learning set, the data except for the test set, to k equal sizes, and use one of that as a validation set in a round robin fashion. And at the end of that, we select the highest scoring candidate on average. We fit the model. When hyperparameters are selected, what we do after that is we fit the model on the entire learning set using the selected hyperparameters. Then we test the performance of that model on the test set. Let's move on to today's topic. Like last 2 days, we will use NumPy and Matplotlib, and we are giving the name NP and PL2 to them. And this line is to increase the font size appearing on our figure. The first topic is regression. From a set of features, we determine a continuous target. One principal example would be creating a function that estimates the cell volume given shape or dimensions of the cell. Often, we will put the features on the x-axis on this plane, and on the y-axis will be the target we would be estimating. The dots represent training samples, And in case of linear regression, we try to find a line that best represents the data, which is defined by intercept and the slope in case of one feature case. So those are the parameters we want to learn. Say we want to predict the volume of a cell by their length, width, and smoothness. In case of linear regression with 3 features, the model would look like this. The volume, which is function of length, width, and smoothness, would be given as some coefficient times length plus some coefficient beta times d plus some coefficient gamma times smoothness s plus v naught intercept. And what we want to do is find the values of alpha, beta, gamma, and v naught. Training in linear regression means that finding the best possible parameters. They are not hyperparameters. Parameters alpha, beta, gamma, and v naught. Yep.
What's the advantage of this over, like, for example, just fitting a like a regression line in like R, Excel, or those?
That is the exact same thing. Yeah.
They are machine learning.
So they can be formulated into machine learning. That is what I would say.
So the result will be the same.
Yeah, the result will be the same. They're using the same model. But yeah, there is some different viewpoints between the context of machine learning and context of statistics. I will get there later today. Yeah, that is a very good question. So a linear regression is any regression of a model that is linear on the fitting parameters alpha, beta, gamma, and v naught. Let's create a simple data set for illustration purposes. We will take 100 samples and we will define the linear coefficient to be 0.5 and intercept of 2.2. And for the features, we will randomly sample the values uniformly distributed between 0 to 10. And p that random gives num samples random numbers between 0 to 1. And we are multiplying that by 10. And for random noises or errors in our data, there always are errors. And to model that, we will randomly sample numbers from 0 to 1 again, and we will subtract 0.5. So the error is 0 on average. Then the minimum will be 0.01, maximum will be 9.96. Average of the error should be close to 0. And with 100 samples, what we have here is minus 0.02. And you might be seeing different numbers because this is random. And using these numbers, we will define the dependent variable or the target values, y. That would be linear coefficient times x plus intercept plus e, the error terms. Let's plot that. We will use the plot function in matplotlib.pyplot subpackage. And we will put a marker in a scatter plot, y versus x. And on the x label, we put feature. On the y label, we put the word target. Then this is what it looks like. And we want to find a line going through these data points. and we want to use the linear model y equals beta x plus gamma. And this is simulated data, and there was the values we used for the model. So we should expect beta to be close to 0.5 and gamma to be close to 2.2. Let's see if we get that. But in the context of machine learning, we always have to split out test set to make sure that our model is predicting the results in a good way. So we use the train test split function. And like we have seen yesterday, Scikit-Learn expects the features to be two-dimensional arrays or matrices in a lot of cases, number of samples by number of features. So we will reshape X to two-dimensional array here, number of samples by 1. And let's split out 33% of the test data, and let's use the remaining 67% as our training data. One may perform linear regression using the class linear regression in linear model subpackage. And yeah, there are nothing much here, no hyperparameters. It is just it is just a simple model that fits a line. Let's create an instance of linear regression. And how to fit the line would be running the fit method with features and labels, X train and Y train, just like what we did yesterday. So what it looks like still is very similar to what we have seen yesterday. Then to plot the line, let's just make prediction from this model using some regularly spaced values. So we will put X array and beta linspace 0, 10, 100. That will give you values 0 to 10, 100 numbers equally spaced between the numbers. And we put that to the predict method of the model we have fit. Keep in mind that X is expected to be two-dimensional, number of samples by number of features. So we reshape X array again. Then we have bunch of values for X array, bunch of values for Y array predicted by our model. And if we plot that in a line, we will see the line that represents the prediction of our model. So we add that line to our figure along with the training data points. And we are just using training data points. Test samples are not to be used here. Then we get this red line going through the blue dots, the training samples. And does it look okay? Maybe. Similar to the classifiers covered yesterday, you can access information of the fitted linear regression model through their attributes. And in case of linear regression, what you have includes coefficients and intercepts. and they end with underscores, which means they will be available only after fitting the model. And if we print out the coefficients and intercepts, we will get these values. Coefficient 0.497, intercept 2.221. So very close to what we would expect, which was 0.5 for the coefficient and 2.2 for intercept. Then how do we measure the performance? In analogy with a classifier's accuracy, the most commonly used metric to evaluate the performance of linear regression is called coefficient of determination. That is R-squared value you see when you fit lines with Excels or other software. Yep.
Same code, but the result are slightly different.
Yeah.
Why is it?
Because today I'm not trying to make sure that everyone has the same data in this random sampling. So in case of regression, one of the performance measures would be the coefficient of determination. It is defined as 1 minus u over v. U would be the residual sum of squares, and that is defined as the total sum of the true y minus the predicted y squared. And v is the total sum of squared, which is the true y values minus the average of those true y values squared, and then added up. So what is known is the total sum of squares. If you add total sum of squares and residual sum of squares, what this means is that the remainder would be the amount of the variation in the data explained by our regression model. The amount of variation in the y values can be explained by the residual sum of squares plus the regression sum of squares, which is the variation in the data explained by our fitted line. And it can be mathematically shown that residual sum of squares plus the sum of squares explained by our regression model adds up to the total sum of squares. So we represent that in the form of ratio using the R-squared definition. So what we do here basically is like this. Can be represented in figure actually. We have many data points and line going through it. And this part, and we have average of y. Then from this data point, if distance from this data point to this line, and if distance from this data point to the average y. And if you add the total distances from all the data points to the mean of y, that is total sum of squares. And if we look at the distance from each data point to the fitted line, that is the residual sum of squares. And the distance between the predicted y to mean of predicted y. The average distance from for each data point from this line to this line. That would be regression sum of squares. And it can be proven that the regression sum of squares plus residual sum of squares is the same as total sum of squares. Maybe I got a bit too complex here. So R square values are guaranteed to have the maximum value of 1 for simple linear regression. And the score that can be obtained using the score function. And we get 0.957. So it is a very good linear fit. Okay, let's talk about what is the difference in the view of machine learning and in the view of statistics. So the difference in the view would be something like this. In case of machine learning, what we are more interested in is the performance in prediction. So we are interested in if we can get a model that predicts the result from when we get a new data into the model. On the other hand, another view of this problem is called inference, where we get those coefficients and we get p-values attached to it. And what we want to do is interpret the model. How, so is this coefficient really non-zero in reality? There we get p-values of each of the coefficients. And try to interpret the meaning of those coefficients. That is more of interest in case of inference. Machine learning is more about prediction. Inference is more about interpretation of the model. Does it make sense to you? It is different view. So when the main goal is inference, often you will not split out the test set. Because what we want to do is to deal with the coefficients, not about the predictive performance. Let's move on to next topic, polynomial regression. A linear regression is any regression of a model that is linear on the fitting parameters. Y equals beta 1x plus beta 2z plus gamma. Then is it a linear regression if the model is given by this formula, y equals beta 1x plus beta 2x squared plus gamma? The answer is yes, because this representation is linear in terms of beta 1, beta 2, and gamma. So we can use the same machinery as linear regression to estimate the values of beta 1, beta 2, and gamma. It is just that we will need to put features as x in one column and x squared in another column. And that is what we would do with polynomial regression part. Let's think about a quadratic model here. Linear coefficient times x plus 0.15 times x squared plus intercept plus error. That gives you 100 by 100. Something is going wrong, it looks like. Let's see what is going on. Shape of x, 100 by 1. Shape of errors, 100. And we added a 100 by 1 number and 100 numbers. And if they are added up together, the result is 100 by 100. That is due to the broadcasting rule of NumPy. If the dimension of two arrays are different, the one with the lower dimension gets one appended at the front, and they try to operate on that. Then it becomes 100, 1 added to 1, 100. And result of that would be considering x to be 100 by 100, epsilon to be 100 by 100, by repeating those values, and they are added up together to form 100 by 100 values. So yeah, the shapes are different, so we are getting some unexpected result. That is the important part in short. So we should make the shapes match. So we also reshape epsilon, the errors, to be 100 by 1 over here. After that, everything will be good. Shape of y will now be, as expected, 100 by 1. So be careful when you operate between NumPy arrays, particularly if they are of different shape. Let's generate the dataset. So we start with reshaping the errors, and we put this model to y, and let's plot that quadratic data. This is what the data looks like for our quadratic model. What would happen if we try to do linear regression on this data? What would you say? Not good? What would be happening? Would it be overfitting? Would it be underfitting? Underfitting. Because the model cannot catch this kind of curvature in data when we are using linear regression. And let's try to put some quadratic regression this time. Again, we will split out test data first. And we will fit linear regression with two features. The first column representing forced order, we just put the training data X. We just put the training data there. And on the second column, we put training values squared. So we have 67 columns and 67 rows and 2 columns, 67 samples with 2 features. And we will fit the linear regression with these features array as the first argument of the fit method. Let's see what happens. then we get two coefficients for each of the feature we put. We get 0.506 for the first coefficient, 0.1497 as the second coefficient, and 2.175 as the intercept. Close to the model we generated the data from, the error coefficient was 0.5, and coefficient for second order was 0.15, and the intercept was 2.2. And again, we can make the prediction along the x-axis again and plot that. And we can do that you can do something like this instead of using the prediction method in this case. X array times the model coefficient plus X array squared plus X array squared times model coefficient 0,1. Because what we have here is a two-dimensional array with two numbers in it. And for the intercept, we have 2.2. And if we run this, we will get that red curve as our fitted model. And it looks good, right? With simple linear regression, we might fit a good model. But let's think about more complex model. The data set we used on day 1, regression exercise data, and that is provided as regression dataset .dat. This one. And actually, this is the data you saw when I first visualized overfitting and underfitting on day 1. And we will recreate those figures shown on day 1 after the break. And let's see how to avoid overfitting. With regularization and overfitting. The data file is on the lecture materials, which has 50 rows and 2 columns. The labels are on this first column, and X values, the features, are on the second column for this data set. And let's split out 20% of the data set as the test set. And let's look at what the data looks like. Kind of data where this curve is curved up a little bit at start and curves down towards the later part of X. So quadratic curve would also overfit on this kind of data set. And it should be something of higher degree polynomials. And we will try with several different degrees of polynomials. So let's define an array to store the coefficients. And model we will use is still the linear regression model. If we try to fit a linear model, which will go really off, oh, we get an error. Let's see. What does it say? Reshape your data, either using array.reshape if your data has a single feature or array, or if it has a single sample. So the issue is with the shape of X. Shape of X was oh, it was still one-dimensional. So we need to make it to two-dimensional again. And with the reshape function, we have made the shape of our array X to be 40 by 1 now. And now let's fit linear regression between X and Y. And this is polynomial with 1 degree, of course. And what we will do is we will store the average absolute value of the coefficients. And we know this is a severe underfit. To use polynomials with higher degrees, we need an array that serves as our input features, having as many columns as the degrees in our polynomial. And an attribute in NumPy that helps you is C underscore, which we used yesterday for column-wise concatenation. So this will now be concatenating two columns, X and X squared, 40 by 2. And let's fit a linear model on these two features, which will be quadratic regression. And we will also draw our curve using the same method. And this is the quadratic curve we get to fit this data. And it still looks like an underfit. So we will go to higher order polynomials. So what we will do is creating a function that creates the 2D array of features for any degree. We will define a function getPoly with my array containing the X values and degree of the polynomial we will use for our model. Then the result will be an array with number of samples by degree. And for each value of degree, we put my array to the power of j plus 1. So it goes through 1 to the value degree. And variable there is to make sure that the array is one-dimensional when we work, when we compute the power of the values. We have to do it to fill in this one-dimensional subarray of the array result. And we return that result. Number of samples by the number of degree or the number of features. Let's try with a 5th degree polynomial. And as we go higher than 2nd degree, adding terms by hand is not very efficient. And we will just use the function getPoly now. For 5th degree polynomial, we can just run getPoly with X and degree. If we try to get the array, it looks like this. (40 by 5). And let's evaluate it and plot it. And to get X values, we put getPoly. And same for the regular spaced values for obtaining the curve on our plot. And for each X poly, we will fit our linear regression model with X poly as the feature and Y as the target. And we will append the degree to our degrees array. And let's do it for d equals 5 first. And with fifth degree polynomial, the fifth looks reasonable now, right? Let's see what happens with 20 degree polynomials. I put the same code down here and just change D to 20. And this is what we get. Looks like severe overfitting. Let's see the values in the list degrees and the list coefficients. And yeah, for 20 degree polynomial, the average coefficient, how many digits are this? Seems unreasonably big. And that wouldn't be an ergonomic way to describe this data. Let's draw a plot of this for simple visualization. And with first degree, second degree, fifth degree, they look reasonable. And with 20th degree, it's up there, 10 to the power of 12 or so. Then how do we try to avoid overfitting in this case? One way may be using the number of degrees as a hyperparameter and do some cross-validation. Another way would be some penalized regression. By the way, Scikit-Learn has a polynomial features class so that instead of using getPoly here, there is a way utilizing the machinery inside Scikit-Learn. We are using getPoly function just to show you some more use of NumPy. So this form of overfitting is common in linear regressions. And for linear regression we have used thus far, there is some optimization happening. Optimization means that we are trying to find values that minimizes certain function. And for regression, often what we minimize with beta is the squared error here. And with 20th-degree polynomial, we had some uncontrolled increase in the model parameters. And to limit that, there is a way to penalize large coefficients. And one way to do that is putting alpha times beta squared. And if we put this kind of parity, this set of beta would have very large penalty, so we will never reach there. And this kind of second term is called regularization, avoiding too complex model. And alpha here would be a hyperparameter to be used in our regression case. So we are going to use Scikit-Learn that linear model import ridge to import a regression model that minimizes that penalized function. And let's try fitting a 20-degree polynomial with a ridge regression. We have x poly 40 by 20. And we use the regression just like what we did with the linear regression model with the new keyword algorithm alpha controlling the complexity of the model. And then even with 20-degree polynomial, we might get something. This time, the curve looks to be off, right? Maybe we are oversimplifying our model. Let's try smaller alpha. How about 0.001? Now it looks reasonable. So we can use some parallelized method to avoid overfitting in regression. And how we choose alpha? That would be using, sorry. How we choose alpha? That would be using some cross-validation technique. We will split this X data set into training set and validation set into further pieces to check some measurement of error. Often that will be mean squared error in parallelized regression case, and there will be an exercise asking you to do so. But let's talk about another popular method of regularization, lasso penalty. So in rich penalty, we added squared value of each coefficient. Now we are adding absolute value of each coefficient. This is called L1 norm. And because of the geometry of those L1 norms, what we encourage is sparsity of beta. Some of the betas will be exactly 0. And this works as feature selection and prediction at the same time. So let's try lasso penalty to our polynomial regression example as in-class exercise now. What you would do here can be as simple as this, just copying the code up there and change switch to lasso actually. Lasso has the keyword argument alpha, so this would work. But yeah, because of some numerical issue, you might get some warning, but it is still running. It is also happening because lasso works better with the normalized data. But yeah, the curve we are getting is somewhat reasonable. And again, to select a good value of alpha, you would need to do cross-validation. Maybe 0.01 is too high here. And if you look at the coefficient there, you can see that only 3 of those coefficients are being non-zero. So in case of very high dimensional data, like statistical genetics data with 1 million features, not samples, something involving lasso parity works well for you to interpret the model with some sparsity. Actually, what works better is called elastic net, which uses both the lasso parity and the ridge parity. And as I mentioned earlier, it is recommended to normalize the features before the analysis with the function normalize in Scikit-Learn pre-processing. And we need that to parallelize each coefficient on the same scale. What we are doing here with polynomials is the values at different degree can have different, they have different ranges. And we have been parallelizing on their different ranges, which might not be nice comparison between those coefficients. So what will be left as homework is here. You can split the data set into training set, validation and set, and the test set, or split the data into learning set and the test set, and then use k-fold post-validation on the learning set to choose the best alpha, similar to what is done in yesterday's workshop. And that will be one of those homework today. That is the regression. So far, we mainly talked about supervised learning. We talked about classification, where the target is discrete values for the target classes. And we talked about regression, where the target is continuous values. Now, we will talk about unsupervised learning, where there is no target variable present. The main idea in unsupervised learning is to discover hidden patterns in the data and use them to generate descriptive statistics. So, in terms of figure, it looks like this. From the data set, we put that to unsupervised learning algorithm, and we will get the result representing some structure in the data set, some clusters or new features, or something else. One of the most fundamental tasks would be clustering, grouping the examples into certain groups with similar features. One example would be k-means clustering. We find k clusters of points in which each observation belongs to the cluster with the nearest cluster centers, which will serve as a prototype of the cluster. Another class of clustering would be hierarchical clustering. It tries to build a hierarchy of structures. So it puts the most similar pair of data together first. And again, it tries to put most similar data points again. And then it tries to form a further clusters by putting similar data, similar existing cluster together, forming hierarchy between clusters. And if we need certain number of clusters, we can cut that at some point to get 3, in this case here, to get 3 clusters. But what we will delve into is k-means clustering. This method partitions the feature space into k clusters based on the means of points. The step is simple. It randomly initializes cluster centers and assign points to the nearest cluster center. With randomly initialized cluster centers here, red, green, and blue, this point gets assigned to red because red is closest from here. This point gets assigned to green because green is closest from here. And this is repeated for all the other points. After doing that, we update the positions of the centers. We have these labeled data points. So we take the mean of those data points to get the new cluster centers. We have one data point in the red class. So the red cluster center moves here. And we take average of these 6 points so that the green center moves here. And for blue, we take average of these 5 data points and blue center moves a bit here. And next step, it will assign data points to the nearest center. And I think this point will go to red, this point will go to red with a new cluster center here. That will be repeated until no more points are changing the clusters, until convergence of the algorithm. That is what we would call. Let's explore the iris dataset using the k-means clustering algorithm, which is one of the most basic datasets considered when we teach machine learning or data science in general. We first import that data using Scikit-Learn datasets. In this dataset, we have measurements from 3 different species of iris plant, Iris setosa, Iris versicolor, and Iris virginica. There are 4 features: sepal length, sepal width, petal length, and petal width. We will use this load iris function to load the data. And the shape will be 150 by 4. And we can take the feature names. We have sepal length, sepal width, petal length, and petal width. Before we move on, let's visualize the data set. You can change the features being visualized below. If we try to visualize column number 1 and column number 3, that would be sepal width and petal width. Then we have data points looking like this. We have 150 of those data points. And yeah, this might not be very informative. Let's visualize. Now, let's add some labels there. And let's have the markers to be smaller in blue dots. We are not showing classes here because we don't use it in case of clustering. What we want to do next is clustering these points into several classes. Let's create k-means model and apply this to the iris dataset. Because we know there are 3 different species of plants in this dataset, we will make an educated guess and use k equals 3. And in k-means object here, that means we will put number of clusters to be 3. We will fit the model with the data array. But something we are doing different from the supervised learning case is that we only put the features to the fit method, not the labels. Because we don't have labels in unsupervised learning. After k-means clustering method is applied, we can get the ID of the clusters to which each of samples is predicted to belong to by the method predict. So again, we pass the features to the predict method. And what we get is the shape What we get includes the shape of it, length 150 because we have 150 samples, and cluster IDs, numbers of 0, 1, and 2. And let's visualize those classes, those clusters, by color coding each cluster ID. So we will build 3 sets of Boolean indexes. One is true if the sample belongs to cluster number 0. The other is true if the sample belongs to cluster number 1. And we do the same for cluster number 2. And if we run this cell, we get 3 colored dots. We have black, we have blue, we have red. Blue is for class number 0. Black is for class number 2. Red is for class number 2. And it looks like each cluster is gathering the samples nearby each other, right? Let's try k equals 4 and inspect what comes out differently. Now we have this yellow class added on top of 3 pre-existing classes. What do you think the differences are? We had 3 clusters here, here, and here. And with k equals 4, it looks like the cluster at the bottom has split it into 2. And red and black, they seem to be the same cluster as blue and red in the figure here, right? One thing to remember is that those cluster labels are just nominal, and it is the same clustering result if the cluster labels got shuffled. And we have seen something like this. This is equivalent clustering. No. No, it isn't. It fit another clustering and it changed it a little bit. This happens because we do random initialization with k-means clustering. And k-means clustering goes to different endpoints depending on where it is initialized. It gets to local minimum. But in many cases, we are getting 3 clusters around here now, and we are getting a cluster at the bottom. Now it looks similar to what we had before, right? Yep. Equal number of steps?
Yeah,
What do you mean by steps?
has to like every center we calculated center.
Oh, how many times we can calculate centers?
Yeah.
Until it converges, until no more points change their clusters. Does it make sense? So one characteristic of k-means clustering is it may have different results each time. And because k-means assumes no number of clusters, there is some freedom, and k can be treated as a hyperparameter as well. But we didn't separate out test set here, right? How do we choose k? That is much harder problem than choosing hyperparameters for classifiers or regressions. But there are ways to do that. That is similar to cross-validation methods, which do not and I have done some research with selecting the value of k in the past. And in terms of clustering in general, there are methodologies that do not assume the number of clusters to be known in advance. There are methods like affinity propagation and density-based clustering, or there is something called dbScan, which is for density-based clustering. And there they have different hyperparameters as well. But number of clusters is not one of them there. K-means is one of the simplest clustering algorithm. But yeah, as you have seen, you get different clustering each time. So it might not be ideal for your application. However, some modifications of it are still widely used, including k-medoids based on medians of the data points, or k-means plus, which is often used as a technique to initialize clusters in k-means, and that is the default to be used in k-means class in Scikit-Learn here. And when applying clustering, please remember that this is different from classification. If what you need is to present categories associated with the samples, and you have categories, often recommended is to use supervised learning if possible. And what you want to do is measuring performance of clustering, then you will use clustering. And what you need is getting some results without knowing the labels. That is when you use clustering. It's 10:30. So let's go to another break, and during this break, let's go to for the last topic of the day. We will talk about some principal component analysis in the context of machine learning. You might have heard of a PCA somewhere else, but it can be included in the umbrella of unsupervised learning methods. PCA is a way to find a set of new features that are uncorrelated among themselves, orthogonal between each other. This is interesting because correlated features overlap in what information content they include. The features PCA finds are linear combination of the original features that maximally describes variations in the feature space. If we give a bit more detail on PCA, we talk about covariance matrix. Covariance is a measure of joint variability of two random variables given by covariance of two random variables x, y equals the expected value of the product of between x and y minus expected value of x times expected value of y. And if the two variables are independent to each other, the covariance between them is 0. For example, the number of people riding New York subway and the probability of rain in New York would have high positive covariance Because if it rains in New York, more people are likely to ride subway. And we define covariance matrix. That is a matrix of covariances between each pair of variables in a set. So if we have three covariate or three variables, we will have 3 by 3 covariance matrix. And on the diagonal, we will have variances, because that would be covariance of x and x, which is expected value of x squared minus expected value of x squared. That is definition of variance, right? And on the off diagonals, there will be covariances x1, x3, x2, x3. X2, x1, x3, x1, x3, x2. And because the definition of covariance is symmetric between each other, this matrix is symmetric. And it has a nice property of being positive definite, which I will not go deeper. And from the covariance matrix, it tries to find a change of basis, the basis maximally describing the variation in data. So if the data points look like this, the direction that maximally describes the variation in data would be this direction, right? So that is the direction of principal component we choose first. And then among all the other directions perpendicular to this, we find another direction that maximally describes the variance. And actually in 2D space, there's only one direction that is perpendicular to this. So that is the second principal component. That is repeated until no more direction is available. Yep. This one?
Yeah.
The value of E. E is a function taking expected value of a random variable. So from a probability distribution, E would be essentially be the average of all the possible samples for the values of x and y. And E of x1 means that we want to take average of all the possible values of x times y. And EX, average of x, EY, average of y. And if they are independent, expected value of x times y is same as expected value of x times x, expected value of y. So covariance becomes 0. If not, covariance value will be positive or negative. Positive if the two variables have positive correlation. Negative if two variables have negative correlation. When x goes higher, y tends to lower, if that kind of thing happens. So after choosing this new principal components, we think about space in terms of these two new axes. Coordinates with respect to those two axes. And with respect to that direction, the covariance matrix is diagonal, because there's no correlation between the two axes. New bases are orthogonal from each other, uncorrelated. Let's see PCA in action by creating three variables with correlation. Scikit-Learn has PCA under the decomposition subpackage because it is related to decomposition of the covariance matrix into several pieces. So let's randomly sample 200 samples with three features. And we will put the values on column number 0 to column number 2. So the first and last feature will be perfectly correlated. Then we can plot the covariance matrix. Actually, we can compute the covariance matrix using the np.cov function. And unlike Scikit-Learn, NumPy's covariance function assumes each row to be each variable. So we transpose X here. Then we get this as the covariance matrix. And just seeing the number, it is hard to understand. So let's visualize the matrix using the match_show function in matplotlib pyplot. And we have high values on the main diagonals, high values on 0, 2 and 2, 0 here. And others are something much lower than that. On the diagonal are the variances, which is always positive, so we get high value. And we sample 0, feature 0 and feature 1 independently. So the correlation between them would be pretty low. But we put the same values on column number 0 and column number 2. So they should have very high covariance. Actually, same value as the values on the diagonal, on the variance part. That's why we get this kind of pattern. And let's apply PCA to this. PCA is unsupervised learning. So when we fit this, we only pass the features. And there's no hyperparameters. What we are interested in with PCA would be the proportions of variance explained by each principal component. How much variation each principal component explains. Because two of the features were perfectly correlated, it is expected to have the first two PCs to explain most of the variance, and third PC to explain almost nothing. Do we see that? It looks like the case when we see the attribute explained variance ratio from PCA. Around 67% of the variation explained by principal component number 0, about 33% explained by principal component number 1, and principal component number 2 explaining almost nothing. And we can see what the components are using the components underscore attribute. And we can see that the principal components with highest variance, the one in the first column, includes variables 0 and 2. And the second principal component, mostly including variable 1. And the third one is just one remaining direction perpendicular to PC1, PC0 and PC1. And shape of X would be 200 by 3. And this is change of bases. So there is a way to transform the data points into this transformed space. And that method is called transform. We can run PC that transform with the data point with the samples X. And we can see that the covariance matrix of that transformed sample is almost diagonal. Larger values on the main diagonal and almost zero values on the off diagonal because they are perpendicular, and almost zero value for the values of the last principal component as well, because there's almost no variation because how we sample the data. And if we visualize it, it looks like this. Yep.
In the covariance matrix, why is there, so I know that the columns are the PCs,
Mm-hmm.
but what are the rows?
What are the rows in this matrix?
Let's highlight that.
What is
Yeah.
highlighted text? This one? Numbers right above it. So we are trying to see covariance matrix. It is number of variables by number of variables, right? Number of features by number of features. So, and this is two-dimensional. So this is index for the features, and these are the index for features as well. Covariance between variable 0 and variable 0. Covariance between variable 1 and variable 0. Covariance between variable 2 and variable 0. That is why this is symmetric, and why this has size of number of features by number of features. Does it make sense to you?
What does the color mean?
What does the color mean? It is showing it is trying to visualize the values in the matrix, and the default color map used here makes yellow to be higher value and blue to be lower value.
So you're comparing the covariance between PC0 and 0 and 1 on the diagonal, right?
Yeah. On the diagonal is covariance between PC0 and PC1. That PC0 and PC0. That is variance of that PC. So that is always positive. And because we chose the direction that maximally describing the variation, this value will be the highest.
Oh,
Yeah. And the most of the remaining variation is explained by PC number 1, so it has lower value. And we don't have much remaining, so it is very close to 0 here. And because these are PCs, they are to be orthogonal to each other, so off diagonals are 0.
and also for the very first step where you're drawing randomly.
Uh-huh. So we are randomly choosing numbers. We will always start with random numbers to get some samples. And we are setting the values on column 2 to be values of column 0. It is just to make that the two features are perfectly correlated. So we are essentially sampling two columns and putting the one from the first column to the last column. Does it make sense? And we can apply this PCA to many different data sets to reduce the dimensionality by choosing only a few of these pieces. We can still explain a lot of parts in the variation of data, right? So this can be used as a way to reduce dimensions as well. That is what we are going to do with the breast cancer data set that we used on day one. We will load the breast cancer data. And we had 569 samples with 30 features there, representing shapes of the cell. Let's split the data into training and test data sets for the classification task. We had in question, which is classified between malignant cells and benign cells. We separate out 20% of the test data. And when you do PCA, even when you do PCA, it has to be only on the training set, not on the test set. Because involving test sets in PCA introduces bias. And we ran PCA already, and let's visualize the importance of each principal component, which can be accessed using explained variance ratio attributes. And we can see the first principal component explaining a lot of variances actually. And it is actually more informative when we put on log scale. So let's set Y scale to log and repeat. And we can see that by the first 5 principal components, the remaining principal components only explain less than 10 to the minus 5 of the total variance. So as a way to perform dimensionality reduction, we can choose only first 2 or first 5 principal components, and we can apply any other machine learning techniques we have learned in this workshop on the data with a reduced dimension. So how about using only the first 2 PC and visualizing that? When we do visualization, often we only have 2 or 3 dimensions on dimensions on the field we see. So it is common to only use 2 dimensions when visualizing. And it looks like this when we plot the 2 principal components of the data set. Red square representing malignant cells and blue dots representing benign cells. And we want to separate between blue dots and red squares. Let's try to fit random forest classifier on the transformed 2-dimensional features. And let's see what we get. So we will fit 100 trees with maximum depth of 5. On the first 2 features of the PCs, XPCAs are the ones transformed from X using the PCA we performed. When we run this, we get the test score of 92.98%, which looks pretty good, right? So even with only 2 features, we are getting reasonable test performance on a very high dimensional, ultra high dimensional data set, such as gene expression, where the number of features is much larger than the number of samples. It often improves the results. Let's try with 5 features because we still have time and we get higher test score. If we use all 30, we might get better results as well. But yeah, using fewer number of features is more ergonomic way to deal with it. And if we had 1 million features, then running this with 1 million features would be close to impossible. And in that case, we would use the reduced dimension. Let's talk about X. That is PCA. Any questions about it? Let's move on to exercise. The homework for you, if you are taking this 4 credits, requirement is to complete at least one of these exercises. First question is to perform hyperparameter tuning for parallelized regression using the regression dataset we had earlier today. Consider the data and ridge regression algorithm with 20-degree polynomials as in the class, and you will tune the hyperparameter alpha using k-fold cross-validation based on the R-square measure. The steps would be similar to what we did with classifiers, but we are using regression models instead. So we will load the data file, we will split out the test data, and define a set of candidates for alpha. And you will choose hyperparameter alpha for the ridge regression using the 4-fold cross-validation. Oh yeah, let's do mean squared error, not the R-squared actually. And you can use a ridge CV object to perform cross-validation on the ridge regression model. I changed R-squared to mean squared error here, because that is something more common in fitting parallelized regression model. So instead of score, there is some function calculating mean squared error. So you will need to find what that function is. Actually, it is given here. CV equals 4 and scoring negative mean squared error here. If you use which CV object. And you will perform the final performance of the 2 with the test set in terms of the mean squared error. Oh yeah, the 2 is ridge cross-validation and lasso cross-validation. So you will fit alpha for ridge regression, and you will fit alpha for lasso regression, and you compare the final performance of the 2 with the test set. The second task will involve PCA and k-means clustering. So we did PCA on the iris dataset in the class. We did k-means clustering on the iris dataset in the class. And for homework, you will perform PCA first and then perform k-means clustering. So you will compute the covariance matrix and fit PCA first. And then you will check what information each PC contains. And then perform the trace formation. And using the first two principal components, you will do k-means clustering with k equals 3. And you visualize the result with two PCs. Does it make sense to you? All right. Then let's move on to concluding remarks. Throughout this workshop, we extensively explored Jupyter Notebook and explored useful functionalities from NumPy and Matplotlib libraries. NumPy for array computation, Matplotlib for visualization. And we studied supervised learning and its two fundamental subfields, classification and regression. And doing so, we investigated Scikit-Learn structure and discussed in detail how to use its documentation. And at the end, we briefly discussed supervised learning. One prominent topic we did not cover in this workshop is neural networks and deep learning. And due to recent advancements in hardware, using multiple layers of neural networks have been massively successful in many fields over the last decade, including image classification and segmentation. And I believe it deserves a separate 3-day workshop with higher hardware demand, with access to GPUs. And the large language models workshop for next week. I think that would involve, in most cases, that would involve some deep learning. There are some more resources if you delve deeper into machine learning. There is a book called Hands-on Machine Learning with Scikit-Learn, Keras, and TensorFlow by Garon. And this takes a similar approach to this workshop with some additional information in deep learning with Keras and TensorFlow software. And one classic introductory machine learning book would be PRML, Pattern Recognition and Machine Learning by Christopher Bischoff. Some mathematical approach to machine learning. And the depth in terms of mathematics is relatively light in this book. And more statistical approach would be an introduction to statistical learning by James Whitten, Hasty, and Tifsharani. They are people in the field of statistics. So it is an intro-level book for people with a bit of knowledge in math and statistics. And there's deeper version of this book, Elements in Machine Learning. And that book would be considered graduate level statistics textbook. And I gave a lecture using that kind of book earlier this weekend, which is much more demanding mathematically. Another book is Machine Learning, a Probabilistic Approach by Kevin Murphy, more mathematically advanced, more Bayesian approach, and whole lot of software in MATLAB is available for this book. And for deep learning, there is a classic introductory textbook by Goodfellow, Bangio, and Corville. The goal of this workshop was to provide basic information to become independent in terms of training machine learning model and to increase knowledge with some online resources. And I hope this workshop helped in this direction. Thanks for coming and hope you enjoyed this workshop. Thank you.